Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Sharmit podcast. Today, I'm here with another special guest, Michael Dowden, who is joining us all the way from United States. Michael is a
Well,
seasoned technology leader with 30 plus years of experience helping over 100 plus companies to build better solution and softwares. Not only this, Michael is deeply involved in making technology more accessible, from writing the book Approachable Accessibility to teaching thousands of developers how to create inclusive and user friendly application. Not only this, apart from this, as a frequent speaker and author, he loves sharing his blueprint for building software that lasts. So, today we will dive into scaling products, user experience, best practices, and serverless architecture. But before we proceed further, I would like to thank Michael for joining us today in this episode. And now I request you to please initiate the discussion by telling us something about yourself.
very good. Thank you. So I would say that I got started in technology really young. I started kind of self-taught in how to build software. I kind of got a computer and started dabbling around with code. And it was like an artist found their canvas. I
Mhm.
found that this was a thing that I could do that allowed me to be creative. It was fun to build things, and right away I realized that this is back in the 80s, and so I realized a lot of people were like new to this computer thing and didn't know how to get started. And so really early on, I'm like, there's got to be a way to make it easy for people to figure out how to use the thing that's in front of them, and became really interested in that very quickly in building user interfaces for the software that I was writing. And just kind of started from there as a kid, dabbling with computers, and it never went away.
Okay. So, like after once you started into the IT industry, you chose a particular path. So, was there any specific moment that really influenced your journey, or that set your goal that yes, this is the thing that you are going to deliver as your core expertise to the industry?
I don't know that there was one special landmark moment. For me, it
Hmm.
was a series of like small things. It was the sudden realization that, hey, I can play with computers all day, and that could be my job. That was a moment, right? And getting into at university and studying software and realizing that this is something that I can help people with, because one of the things that I did in university is teach people how to program, because I ended up being a teaching assistant. I had a lot of business students who had to take some programming courses but weren't
Hmm.
wanting to be programmers, and some of them were struggling with some of the concepts, and so they would hire me to help them learn things. And that really got me very early on in, hey, this is something that I can explain to people in a way that they can understand. And then I started, as I was building software and building user interfaces and getting feedback on it, it just kind of magnified very quickly, step by step, and like lots of little tiny uh, interactions that I had with people as I was learning to build software.
Okay. So, what was your first programming language, from which you started your journey?
The very first programming language for
Yes.
me was BASIC on the ROM of the Tandy TRS-80.
Okay.
So really, really early. And I eventually learned several different other flavors of BASIC, and eventually graduating to Quick Basic, which could be compiled and distributed as software. After that, I taught myself C++. These
Okay.
days, I mostly use TypeScript, but it's been quite a journey in lots of different languages.
Okay, so let's say if someone asks you to give some suggestions for the new developers who recently started their career in 2025. So what are
Mhm.
those primary languages you would like to suggest them to start their career with that particular tech? Although like it totally depends on the interest of the particular person, but what are those skill set you would like to suggest?
Yeah, that's a great question. It does depend on what you're interested in to some
Yes.
extent. I would say that you can never go wrong learning TypeScript or Python today.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I would also say that learning either C sharp or Java has a lot of applicability within industry if that's
Yes.
something you wanted to pursue. So I would start with one of those languages. I don't feel like there's one primary language that's better than any other. Um, when you're first learning, Pascal is a great language for learning, but it's not super applicable in industry. So
Yes. Okay. So, Michael, like so far, like you have worked with over 100 plus companies in just 30 years. So,
yeah,
what is one standout lesson you have learned from your so far journey?
I would say the biggest lesson for me has been humility.
Okay.
You are going to be able to learn something
Mm-hmm.
everywhere you go if you are open to doing so. And one of the reasons that I've been able to work with over 100 companies is as a consultant, right? I've been
Okay.
able to get hired sometimes for extended periods of time for a lot of different businesses, sometimes multiple at the same time as a consultant. And usually I'm hired for my expertise.
Mm-hmm.
But if you come in to a company like that with an assumption that you know everything and they know nothing, and I've seen consultants do this, you will be missing opportunities to grow. You will be missing out on opportunities to teach, and you'll be
Mm-hmm.
missing out on opportunities to build your consulting practice. And if you come in with humility and say, these people know what they're doing, but there's a challenge that I can help them with,
Okay.
and you come in and you try to learn first, and then teach second, and then
Right.
fix third, it's absolutely revolutionary. It makes such a big difference in how you're perceived, how you're welcomed into that organization, and in your ability to grow because you're learning things from people. One of the ways that I implement this in my own coding practice is every junior developer submits their code for code review.
Mm-hmm.
Every senior developer submits their code for code review to the junior developers.
Correct.
You,
Right.
you learn from this. It's great.
Yes. Okay. And you know what? Like you are known in the industry for as a person like who is expert in building the software that scale to millions. So what is your blueprint or for building the scalable products? Like what are those key thing that you hold as a secret in front of all IT industry person that makes you set apart from others?
So, ironically, don't
Mm-hmm.
scale too soon. So often we as developers and engineers move first for the big tech solution. What is the big engineering solution? How many servers do I need? How many services do I need? How can I scale this thing out and be ready to grow big? And some of the most valuable software that I have written,
Mm-hmm.
some of the software that I was paid the most to write, was delivered to, I don't know, 10 or 20 people. That was the
Yes.
entire user base. The scalability that was needed there was not in terms of users, it was in terms of vast, vast quantities of data. It was for a scientific application where they needed to be able to dig into the data in very meaningful ways. Um, I've had other systems where the profit per customer is extremely large, and so they can
Mm-hmm.
grow profitably with a very small user base. I've had other situations where you need millions and millions of users, but they're not doing big workloads. And so to me, the secret to scalability is start simple, Start only with what you need.
Mm-hmm.
Understand exactly how it is you need to be able to scale. What is the metric by which you're scaling? Understand that very, very well and then build for it. When you are building out software for millions and millions of users,
Mm-hmm.
one of the best ways you can scale it is to do most of the work on the device in their hand,
Okay.
right? Building software where you can do a lot of the work in the web app or in the mobile app or on the desktop means that you don't need as much server side architecture, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're doing a lot of the lifting, you have to understand the security model, you have to understand the privacy, you have to understand how much data is being transmitted. What's their network bandwidth? You've got to deal with other types of considerations, but you don't have to deal with scaling backend hardware as much. And it's also um, going along this lines of starting simple, start with the users, understand the things you're scaling with, and then build as simply as possible because you want to build as you learn. You don't want to assume that you know. It gets back to that humility thing, right? If I
Right.
assume that I can see the future and know what's going to happen and I'm going to build for it in advance and then I'm wrong, I have a really big problem, especially because I'm going to find out I'm wrong at exactly the moment that I need to be moving very, very quickly because I'm trying to scale up to some new situation and I need to be in a position to adapt to that very quickly. It's one of the things that's led me into the world of serverless architecture, quite frankly, is I can build simply and have a platform that can meet me where I'm at very quickly
Mm-hmm.
without me having to do a lot of work.
Okay. All right. So another thing that you believe, and I think most of the developer also believe that user experience consideration is considered as a transformating thing for the project outcome. We
Sure.
all know like project outcome is totally depend on user experience. So what core UX principle do you always keep in mind while designing the UI or while creating the projects? What are those core principles?
Um, one of the, I mean, the standard UX principles are pretty well defined. I don't think it's interesting to talk about them, although I think they're extremely important. And I encourage everyone who doesn't know them to go read up on UX. But for
Mhm.
me, the thing that is unique is remembering that you are probably not your target audience
Yes.
as a developer. The way you work with computers, the way you work with technology, the way we work with your phone is probably
Correct.
different than what your users will do. And I think the first and most important UX principle is to understand that you're not the user and that your experience is not going to be a good template for what your users should do. The second big UX principle from my standpoint is when somebody in the organization gives me user feedback and says, we need to do
Hmm.
this, this is what the users are asking for. How many users are asking for this? Often you'll find that, and this is the way our brains work, right? We try to build patterns very
Yes.
quickly from the available information. So if just two or three customers or two or three users say something, it's very easy for somebody to assume that that is a big problem that we need to address right away, that it's affecting
Hmm.
all the users. And it may not be. It may be that those two or three users have a completely different need or a completely different use case than the 99.9% of the other users that you haven't heard from. And that the reason you've heard from these three is because this is a problem for them, but only them. And so it's important to look at statistical modeling to understand um, the scope of the total user base and to not make assumptions based on a very, very small number of vocal users. It doesn't mean you don't necessarily want to serve them and help them,
Hmm.
but assuming that they are speaking for everyone can lead you down a road of making really catastrophic decisions in terms of how you adapt your user interfaces. So you've got to be
Okay.
really careful. And everybody's different. Everybody approaches things different. You could walk into any office in the world and sit behind somebody's computer, and it will feel foreign to you because everybody they'll set up their keyboard different. They'll set up their mouse different. They'll have their keyboard mappings different. They'll have their windows in different places. They'll have icons in different places. We
Right.
all think about things subtly in subtly different ways. and every user is unique, and it's
Correct.
important to kind of keep that in the back of your mind, right?
Okay. So is there any particular example or project you have witnessed where you think experience has completely changed the project outcome?
Oh, sure. I mean, that's something that we're often hired to do.
Mm-hmm.
In one case, there was just a really painful adoption pipeline because from the hooking the users to trying to get them onboarded into the product
Mm-hmm.
was confusing, right? Because the the UI layout was confusing, the words that were used were confusing, and they just didn't understand what was coming, what was happening next.
Okay.
And so there was one specific project that I'm thinking of where we radically increased adoption for them by simplifying, by communicating,
Mm-hmm.
um, by and simplifying does not necessarily mean removing steps. That's something that's often misunderstood. You don't necessarily want to remove the reduce the number of steps that a person has to take to complete something.
Okay.
What you want to do potentially is actually decrease the cognitive load at each step,
Mm-hmm.
make it so that it's really clear, what do I do now? What do I do now? And sometimes reducing the number of steps increases the number of things they have to do at one time and
Okay.
can increase the cognitive load and make something overwhelming. But you have to test that. That's not always true. Um, One of the mistakes that I've made is oversimplifying something,
Mm-hmm.
assuming that we were trying to reduce cognitive load and simplify a user interface, because that's kind of what we were asked to do, only to discover that 95% of the users were super users and they
Right.
wanted everything available all at once. And in their context, they needed everything. And that was a situation where we presented an improved UI and it was universally rejected because and then this is again a case where they listened to the small number of users that were having problems when most of the people actually wanted more consolidation. They wanted more power features and not a simpler user interface. And so that ended up being a different situation where we actually ended up producing two different user interfaces. One that was the power user interface and the one that was simplified for the casual users, which there were much fewer.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay, so Michael, let's talk a bit about your another expertise, which is teaching and your role as an author, because you
Mhm.
have taught thousands of developers and written so many books. So, what's your philosophy when it comes to making technical topics approachable for everyone? So, what that core philosophy you believe in?
The core philosophy is to pick an audience and write to that audience.
Okay,
It doesn't matter too much what that audience is, so long as you're sure that you're not excluding everyone. But the reason this is important is you can't write for every audience. And
right.
I can't tell you the number of times that I have given a technical presentation at a technical conference
Mm-hmm.
and had two pieces of feedback that, wow, this was way too simple. And then two other comments, wow, this was really advanced and kind of over my head.
Right.
And then there's, 100 other people in the room with completely different feedback. And the answer is that if you write to a beginner audience,
Mhm.
that's fine. You're going to exclude a bunch of people. If you write to an advanced audience, you're going to exclude a bunch of people. And no matter how you choose to target, you can't reach every audience at the same time. You have to decide, am I doing this for beginners, intermediate, advanced learners? What information do I expect them to know coming into this presentation or reading this book or reading this blog post? And write to that, and as much as possible, try to communicate that. So if you're writing a book, include lots of details in the foreword or in the back panel or in the introduction of who is this book for? Kind of give inklings about what you expect them to know coming into that.
Okay.
Because kind of marketing to your audience is an important part of this concept because you want to write to one audience so that you make for consistency, you want to reach that audience, but then you have to make sure that the correct audience comes in. So when
Yes.
you're doing a conference presentation, for example, try to include indications of the level you're speaking at. What do you expect them to know coming in? Include those details in your abstract so that you attract the right audience because as much as you can't make everybody happy and you need to pick a small group that you're going to reach out to, if you write your conference abstract in a way that a completely different group of people comes in, then you're speaking to a different group than the one that's actually in the room, and that's when you have a real problem.
Okay. All right. So, I think one of your famous book is Approachable Accessibility. So, what motivated you to write this book, and when did you decided that yes, this is the perfect topic through which you are going to contribute?
Um, my partner and I decided to write that book together
Okay.
after working on a big uh, government project where we had been doing a lot of accessibility work, and we were also doing consulting and had been working with a number of companies. And as we were doing this big accessibility project, we started to see the complete, even more clearly, the lack of accessibility in a lot of other places. And we wrote the book initially because the state that the industry was in at the time, the state that we were in as the time as consultants, is just having to teach people the basics. What is accessibility? Why should I care about it? How do I get started? And one of the key parts of that book that was important to us is to talk a little bit about figures in the industry that have helped kind of make web accessibility possible. We focused really hard on web accessibility. And
Okay.
then if you're at a company that's not doing anything about accessibility today, how can you get started? How can you help get build adoption to get something off the ground? And that was kind of the goal of writing it. And it was the goal of writing it because that was the problem that we saw at the time, and it's something that we wanted to be instrumental in fixing. And as consultants, we also wanted to use it as a way to kind of talk about what is going to be our approach when we come in and work with you. And we ended up
Okay.
using that book a little bit in some web curriculum that we taught, as well as in some cases, sending a copy to a client in advance, saying, this is what we're going to be working through.
Mhm.
You good with this? Are we ready to jump into this project together?
All right. So what do you think? Like, what are the biggest myth about the accessibility in tech? Because there are some people like still believe and there are some kind of restrictions or some myths are there that encourage them to
Yeah.
uh, or demotivate them to move from the accessibility. So what do you think? What are those myths?
So I would say there's a few big myths out there. One of the myths is that if you make your product more accessible, that
Mm-hmm.
you'll make it less beautiful or less attractive or less usable for other people. And that's simply
Okay.
not the truth. Um, it is perfectly possible to make a good accessible product
Mm-hmm.
that loses nothing in the process. The
Okay.
secret is to build and design with accessibility in mind from the very beginning. Don't try to bolt it on at the end because that's when you run into challenges. Another big myth that I've seen is that you can do all the accessibility testing you need in a completely automated fashion. And then if you run an automated test and it tells you you haven't missed any criteria, then you're 100% good and everything you've done is accessible. And that is simply not true. Most of the WCAG accessibility guidelines, for example, can only be tested manually.
Okay.
You need to test with the keyboard. You need to test with the screen reader. You need to interact with the software in a manual way. You can't just automate the testing of a lot of those things. And some of them are very subjective criteria. And so that's where it can be important to get user feedback on how this is working. You can't just write an automated test and be confident in your accessibility. And the third big myth that I see is that we can fully automate the fixing of accessibility issues. And that is also not true. And almost every attempt that I see to use some automated or off-the-shelf solution to just quick fix my accessibility, it almost always has the exact opposite impact because one of the guiding principles of accessibility is to put the end user in control as much as possible,
Mhm.
allow them to customize or configure their browser or their software or their operating system in whatever way that works for them. Allow them to use whatever tools or technology or devices make computers usable for them. We want to
Okay.
put them in charge. And when we try to provide our own technical solution to that, it is not just building accessible software from the get-go. If we try to add bolt-ons to our software, that almost always gets in the way of the user's own preferences and devices and things that they're doing. We don't want to do that.
Okay. And one thing I forgot to ask, like you mentioned about your book. So from where the users can get the book, like is it available on Amazon or any
Yeah.
other portal you are using?
Yeah, all of our books are available on Amazon currently.
Okay.
And our two, the CSS book and the accessibility book are both available directly from Springer. It was published by A Press.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, Michael, like you also spend 7+ years with serverless technology. So, what are the common myths, or I would say the pitfalls you have heard about this serverless technology? So, could you please just share your knowledge bit on this?
Yeah. The two biggest challenges I see when people are trying to adopt serverless for the first time,
Mm-hmm.
if they're coming from a kind of a monolith architecture, I find that they often try to move large quantities of code that do a lot of work and put them into a serverless function. And that simply doesn't work because serverless functions have major constraints on how much CPU or RAM they can have, how long they're allowed to run. And you have to get into more of a functional mindset of breaking the problem down and
Mm-hmm.
doing it in smaller pieces that can be parallelized and other things in order to gain the advantages. But if you're coming from a microservices world, it's a lot simpler. You can just kind of move your microservice code into a function. But a lot of times you're missing out on another big cool thing about serverless, and that is making it fully event driven.
Okay.
So most companies, if they have not adopted serverless yet, and even if they're in a microservices world, they have all these different web services. You're going to call them with an HTTP call of some kind. You're going to use SOAP or JSON, and you're going to pass messages back and forth, but
Mm-hmm.
you're doing it by service call through HTTP. And serverless functions in basically any platform. I primarily work with GCP, Google Cloud. You can write database triggers. When this data gets written into the database, I want to go do this other action. I can write a message queue functions. It'll respond to messages getting published into a queue. You can
Yeah.
write timing functions that happen at specific times. You can write functions that react to people logging in.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to think in a very event-driven model. And rather than having to write the bridge software that says that manages doing lots of things and calling lots of services, which is a very intensive thing. It's very hard to manage. It's harder for developers to troubleshoot. But if you build for the event from the get-go, you get into this very functional way of thinking where you have preconditions and postconditions, and you can modify your software very easily. You can chain things together in ways that make sense and are easily testable and easily reproducible, easily modifiable. Your software
Okay.
becomes more orthogonal, and you can even potentially deploy a new function to do a new thing without impacting the rest of your deployed software. And so thinking about serverless as more than just HTTP endpoints that run independently and thinking about it more of an entire ecosystem of event-driven functionality can completely revolutionize the way you start to think about building software.
Okay. So how do you help developers think about the cost, security, and maintainability when going for the serverless? Because we all know like these are the three things that highly impact your project and the outcome as well. So how do you help the developers?
For sure. So these are fairly different things. So maintainability, I'll start with that. It's the easy one. For maintainability, it becomes about sometimes it's about documentation,
Okay.
understanding how things work together. Um, because when you're in this big event-driven system, you can't always look at a single piece of code and
Mm-hmm.
understand what came before it and what came next, right? And so that's the one advantage that big monolithic architectures have is that it's very, very easy to look at a piece of code and trace your way up and down from it.
Okay.
That can be much harder in a serverless world, but it's the benefits are worth it, but you need to think about from a maintainability standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
how am I going to communicate not to my other developers? What are the preconditions? What are the expectations I have when this function runs? And what is the state that I'm going to leave when it exits? You want to communicate that maybe in a code comment on the top of the function. Consider including information about what might happen next. Write diagrams. So I maintain diagrams for individual systems within my
Okay.
projects. Like these are the types of things that are going to execute when certain events happen, so that we have a starting point on how do we start troubleshooting through things. I use types. So I use TypeScript. So I use the typing as a method of communication. Where else is this type used? And that's going to help me figure out other places I'm interacting with the same type of data, right?
Okay.
Lots of things like that. Be really consistent in your naming. It allows you to find things. So that's kind of where I go for maintainability. Cost depends so much. So at an initial level, serverless can be very cheap to get started.
Okay.
Where you run into problems is when you're thinking about serverless functions in a very um, monolithic way, and you end up with pulling in more data than you need, or you end
Mhm.
up running longer than you should, or you throw too much CPU at it and it gets more expensive, or you're running functions way more often than you need to. These are the types of scenarios where you start running into cost problems. And so it becomes really important to consider inside of a function that you're writing. Am I only grabbing the data that I need to use? How often do I actually need this to run? And start asking those questions. First, build it. And
Okay.
here's the magic, right? With serverless, I can build the thing
Mm-hmm.
and it automatically from the very beginning can scale up to meet my demand. It can scale down to zero. And I have something that works.
Okay.
From there, I am now in a position where maybe it's expensive, but I am in a position where I can serve my users and now take time to fine tune individual functions, individual things. So the important thing is to monitor what it is that's costing you money, what function is it, and then understand what is it about that function that's causing the problem. Is it running too often? Is it using too many resources? Is there a simpler way to do this? And in some cases, there was a big example. I think it was Netflix. No, it wasn't. It was Amazon Prime. I remember it was Amazon Prime.
Okay.
They ended up for part of that service building a monolith
Mm-hmm.
again for part of the application. And there was a big article that said, "Oh, serverless has failed. Even Amazon doesn't use serverless anymore." It's like, no, 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 that's not true at all. In fact, they never could have built the service in the first place if they hadn't gone serverless. They could never have met the demand. So what happened is they built a serverless solution. It was very expensive and in some places fairly complex. They carefully monitored and identified where the problems were, and
Mm-hmm.
then using a very carefully crafted approach, they took the services that were complex or expensive to distribute and they centralized them. They said, we're always doing these things at the same time. So instead of having, I don't know, 50 different functions that are all accessing the same data and kind of need to collaborate with each other, they just
Yeah.
built one single monolith that would grab the data one time, do everything they needed it procedurally, and end, right? And it
Right.
turned out that that was faster and cheaper than the serverless approach that they had at first. But they had the time and the patience and the flexibility to do the thing because they already had something that was functioning and serving customers and meeting demand. And so they had the time to very carefully craft and design a good solution and then slowly replace the old solution with the new one, knowing full well what the parameters and criteria were going to be for success.
Okay.
And to me, that's the correct way to handle kind of cost types of things. You can kind of work with security that way a little bit, but the important thing with security is you've got to get it right from the first time. And with serverless solutions, a lot of times, security, especially in a web forward serverless platform, your security model is not going to be having code sitting behind a VPN on a server somewhere. That cannot be your security model. And that really is hard for a lot of traditional infrastructure folks to handle. And like in Google Cloud, they're on a zero trust model. It's basically we're not going to trust anybody
Yeah.
to be an authorized user. We're going to test everything all the way through the system. It's a completely different way of thinking about security. It is easier in some ways and it is harder in others, but it's a different paradigm than what a lot of companies are accustomed to. And so that can be one of the challenges to serverless adoption is just how are we going to change our thinking around security to be very zero trust, to be very uh, building this into every single aspect of what we're coding, right? It's a
Right.
completely different paradigm.
Okay. So, like Michael, you have helped and touched so many lives as an author, as a Google developer expert, and a tech expert. But I just want to know, like, who are those person in your life who have helped you in your journey, in either way, through professionally or personally? So, who are those key people for you?
Right. There's been so many people that I've worked with over the years that have had an impact on me.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to me being somebody that is visible in the industry, that
Okay.
is a GDE, that is an MVP, that is a public speaker, I can trace a lot of that back to Chad Green, who ran a tech conference here for many years and was the conference organizer that gave me my first opportunity to be a speaker. And
Okay.
then we became friends and over years have done a lot of things together. But he was very instrumental in kind of helping me get started on that front. Another really important person, especially for the last 15 years, is my partner Martine. We've been working in business together. We've written 3 books together, um, and been side by side on this journey of being speakers, of being authors, of being consultants, and trying to continually get better at accessibility and user experience.
Okay. All right. So, thank you so much, Michael, for joining this episode and for sharing so much information about your expertise. So, thank you once again for being a part of
Yeah.
the show.
Thank you.